Peter Curtin was born on May 26, 1883 in Cologne, Germany. During his childhood, he dealt with an alcoholic father who would abuse him, and he would witness on multiple occasions his parents having sex. There would be plenty of signs that Curtin would turn out to be a serial killer. He would resort to bestiality with dogs or other farm animals due to hiding his sexual tendencies. While assaulting them, he would stab them as well to get an extra thrill out of it. According to him, at only 9 years old, he said he held 2 boys underwater until they drowned. At 16, he decided he wanted to be out on his own, so he robbed his family and left. However, while on his own, he would be arrested for petty theft and spend a month in jail. Shortly thereafter, he would be arrested for theft and be sent to 4 years in prison. He would continue to be in and out of prison during his teenage and adult years for crimes such as sexual assault, theft, and arson. After being released from prison in 1913, Curtin had begun to have fantasies of killing people, and in May of that year, he would unfortunately commit his first murder. He found himself at a home in Mulheim, Germany, with the intention of just robbing it. He broke in, but once he found 10-year-old Christine Klein inside, his plans changed. She was fast asleep when he strangled her to death. He then sexually assaulted her, slashed her throat, and once he saw her body covered in blood, he ejaculated. Just 2 months later, he did the same thing to a 17-year-old girl. He would not commit any more murders for a while due to being drafted into the German army in 1914, and shortly after being arrested and sent to prison for desertion. He would be released in 1921 and then moved to Altenburg, where he got a job as a molder and met his future wife named Auguste Scharf. She owned a candy shop, was a former sex worker, and she murdered her former fiance. She didn't know anything about Curtin committing these 2 murders. He would begin to start having a normal life until 2 maids came forward and accused him of sexually assaulting them. He would be found guilty and once again was in prison. Scharf would still stay with Curtin. After his release, he had a huge desire to go back to killing, and of course, he would act on it. He would kill multiple people in Düsseldorf, Germany, starting in February of 1929. When he killed these people, he would usually use a pair of sharpened scissors to torture and then kill them. Police would notice this pattern, so he started using a hammer or a knife to try and throw them off. After some of his murders, he would drink the victims' blood from their wounds, which is why people started calling him the Vampire of Düsseldorf. He also had attempted to kill many more during this time, but they would escape since Curtin had an orgasm before they died. When police showed up and discovered the victims, Curtin would return to the crime scene and talk to the police, acting as a worried citizen. It wouldn't be until November of 1929 that he would stop his murder spree. His last murder was a 5-year-old girl who he had stabbed 30 times and then put her body underneath a bunch of rubble. On May 14th, 1930, he attempted to commit another murder on a young woman named Maria Budlik, who he sexually assaulted, but he decided to let her go. After her escape, she didn't report to the police, but instead would write a letter to her friend. However, the letter would accidentally end up at the wrong address, and the person who received it turned it into the police, who immediately began a search. Curtin would soon realize that he was close to being caught, so he went to his wife and told her everything that he had done. She was obviously shocked and decided to turn him in and receive the money the police offered for anyone who knew the killer. He would confess to 79 different crimes and 9 murders, in which he showed no remorse for. In fact, he said it was revenge for the trauma he experienced during his childhood and in prison. He would be quoted saying, "I had to kill, and I did not kill either people I hated or people I loved. I killed whoever crossed my path at the moment my urge for murder took a hold of me." The trial would last 2 months, and by the end of it, they decided on the death penalty, and he would be executed in the guillotine. On July 2nd, 1931, the execution would be carried out, and his last words would be, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." After that, the blade would come down, ending Curtin's life. Today, his head is displayed at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin. Images are available of this online.
Flight 4805. Flight 1736.
It's the morning of March 27th, 1977. Flight 4805 and Flight 1736 are airborne when a call comes in from the Gran Canaria Airport in Las Palmas, which both flights were supposed to land at. A terrorist bomb had gone off at the terminal there, and now all the flights traveling there have to find another place to land since police have closed the airport. The nearest place to land was Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife, Spain. Soon this airport became engulfed in many planes, which it was not meant for. It was so bad they had to start putting planes in lines on the taxiways since there was nowhere else to go. Also, it was a small airport and prone to fog, but unfortunately, no one paid attention to these significant details. Flight 1736 would be parked right behind Flight 4805, which blocked it in. Eventually, when the airport reopened, Flight 4805 needed to refuel, which caused Flight 1736 to have to wait even longer. By this point, there was so much fog that the controllers in the tower couldn't see the planes at all. As a result of this, they only could rely on radio communications. It wasn't until 5 p.m. that finally both of the flights were ready to leave the airport. Flight 4805 would taxi onto the runway to prepare for takeoff, while Flight 1736 was told to taxi down the runway and depart using the third taxiway. However, due to the amount of fog, Flight 1736 missed their exit and kept booking it down the runway. Meanwhile, the captain for Flight 4805, Captain Van Zanten, thought that he was able to take off after hearing the controller on the radio say the plane was ready for takeoff. It turns out though that the captain misheard him, and instead the controller said, "Stand by for takeoff." Flight 4805 would then begin takeoff. As Flight 1736 was rushing down the runway, Captain Grubbs noticed the lights of another plane coming towards them, and he began yelling, "Get off! Get off!" and tried to swerve the plane off the runway. Flight 4805 also noticed Flight 1736 flying towards them and tried to pull back to try and fly over the plane. It looked like it almost worked, but the underside of the fuselage and engines collided with Flight 1736 upper deck, and both the planes burst into flames. In total, 583 people would die from this tragic accident. 61 people would somehow survive this accident. Because of this, many safety factors would be put into place, like the word "okay" and the phrase "we are at takeoff" being banned for being too vague, and ground radar is now required at airports. No one was ever punished for this accident, and it remains the most deadly plane disaster in history. The person driving this car is Sue Sharp, and with her is her 5 children: John, Sheila, Tina, Ricky, and Greg. The dozen of them are headed towards their new home in Keddie, California, after Sue was able to escape her abusive husband. Finally, after the long drive from Connecticut, the family would step out of the car into the cool autumn air and gaze at their new home, which was simply known as Cabin 28. It's the evening of April 11th, 1981. Sue and her 5 kids have been living in the cabin for months now, and they absolutely love calling it their home. Ricky and Greg would ask their mom if it was okay that they had their friend named Justin Eason over to spend the night. Just like them, Justin, his mom, and stepfather had also recently moved to one of the cabins, which is number 26, in November of 1980. Ricky and Greg weren't the only ones who had plans, as Sheila was going to a sleepover at a friend's house. John and his friend, Dana Wingate, were going to Quincy, California, which is only a 10-minute drive, then would come back to hang out in John's bedroom and basement. And Tina went over to cabin 27 to watch TV and would return to her cabin at around 10 p.m. that night. As the night continued and the cool spring air danced across the green grass, everyone was having fun and looking forward to what tomorrow would bring. It's Saturday morning. The door to cabin 28 creaks open, and in walks Sheila, who is returning from her sleepover. As she steps in, she notices a disgusting odor lingering around the room. When she steps into the living room, she can't believe what she is seeing. Her brother John is laying on his back on the ground. He has been bound, and his face and neck are covered in blood. Next to John was a boy who turned out to be Dana, and he was laying face down, but both their feet were tied together. As her eyes spun around the room, she saw a yellow blanket that was covering a body, and after coming upon this horrible scene, she fled the cabin and started screaming for help. When the authorities arrived to start their investigation, they made many mistakes. The crime scene was not properly secured, and Justin Eason would tell them that Tina was missing, but officers ignored him and continued to investigate. Justin, Ricky, and Greg were asleep in a different room in cabin 28, and none of them were harmed. Investigators would find the yellow blanket, and when they lifted it up, they found Sue's deceased body, and she had also been bound. She was thus wearing a robe, and her underwear had been put in her mouth along with a ball of tape. They were both being held in place with an extension cord that had also been tied around her legs and ankles. Both Sue and John had been beaten with a claw hammer and stabbed multiple times in their bodies and throats. Dana had the same thing happen to him, but he had been beaten with a different hammer and he had been strangled. Inside the home, 2 kitchen knives were found, and one of them had been used with so much force that the blade was bent. A hammer, a pellet gun, and a pellet were found on the living room floor, which made investigators believe that the pellet gun was used in this gruesome murder. The living room floor had a significant amount of blood on it, and there were drops of blood found on Tina's bed. A bloody footprint was discovered in the yard, and knife marks were carved into the wall of the house. At this point, authorities believed that the motive to kidnapping Tina was rape instead of killing her inside the house. They would soon start asking neighbors if they heard anything that night, and a woman and her boyfriend, who were in the cabin right next to cabin 28, said they woke up at around 1:30 a.m. and heard what they believed to be muffled screams. They got up and looked around to try and find where they were coming from, but found nothing, so they went back to bed. This confused the police. Justin, Ricky, and Greg were asleep in the same house, and they didn't wake up at all, but it woke up the neighbors. They were also confused on why the killer didn't harm them at all. Another neighbor that was interviewed was Martin Smart, who was Justin Easton's stepfather. On the night of the murders, one of his friends, named Bo Boed, was staying with him. He said that they only met a few weeks ago, and they met at a Veterans Administration hospital, and they were both getting treated for PTSD. He said that on the evening of the murders, himself, his wife Marilyn, and Bo decided to get drinks and went to the backdoor bar, which Martin worked at as a chef, but it was his night off. Before they left, they asked Sue if she wanted to go with them, to which she declined, and they left without her. While at the bar, Martin became angry at the music that was playing and started complaining to the manager about it. Shortly after he started complaining, they all left to return to their cabin. However, Martin was still angry over the music and called the bar to complain about it again. Martin and Bo would end up going back to the bar for more drinks while Marilyn slept. After telling them all of this, authorities found Martin really suspicious and decided he was their main suspect. They contacted the Department of Justice in Sacramento and had 2 DOJ investigators, Harry Bradley and P.A. Krim, come and conduct interviews with Martin, Marilyn, and Bo. When interviewing Marilyn, she said that the day after the murders, she and Martin decided to separate. She said that he had a bad temper, he was abusive and violent. After all the interviews were done, Martin was polygraphed, and the detectives had decided that none of them were involved in the murders. However, later on, Marilyn was interviewed once again, and she said that Martin despised John, and on the morning of April 12th, she saw Martin burning something in a fireplace. Something else interesting would arise though. Justin Easton brought up a dream that he had. Justin was on a boat and he saw John and Dana fighting a man with long black hair, a mustache, and black glasses. He was also wielding a hammer. John would end up throwing the man and Dana overboard. Dana was also very drunk in this dream. He then saw a body covered in a sheet on the bow, and when he lifted the sheet up, he saw Sue, and she had a knife punctured into her chest. Justin tried to help her by putting a rag onto the wound, but she would eventually toss it into the water. The weird thing is, in real life, Sue did have a chest wound. While he was getting polygraphed, Justin would once again bring up a new detail. He told the polygrapher that he might have seen the murders after waking up from a noise and looking through the door and seeing Sue laying on the couch while 2 men stood in the room. One of the men had black hair and dark glasses, while the other one had brown hair and was wearing army boots. John and Dana would go confront the 2 men, which as a result started a fight. Dana would attempt to escape out the window, but the man in army boots would attack him with a hammer. John and the man in dark glasses would start fighting, and Sue was attempting to help John get the man away from him. After witnessing all this, Justin hid behind the door, and the next time he looked through the crack, he saw the man tying up John and Dana. He also said Tina would come into the room holding a blanket, confused on what was going on. As soon as the 2 men saw her though, they grabbed her and took her out the back door as she began screaming for help. The man in dark glasses would then grab his pocket knife and cut the young girl in the middle of her chest. Justin would do his best to try and explain what these 2 men looked like to the police, and together they came up with these 2 sketches. Interviews would continue to be conducted with neighbors, and one of them, who moved 2 weeks before the murders, said that the week before he moved, he heard Sue Sharp and a man yelling at each other. The screaming match would last for over 30 minutes. Authorities would eventually dig into the interviews that Bradley and Krim did with Martin and Bo, and they discovered a lot of issues. They didn't fact-check Martin's or Bo's testimonies, despite them having a bunch of holes. During Bo's interview, he said many lies. He claimed that he worked as a police officer in Chicago for 18 years and retired after being shot while in the line of duty. This could have easily been discovered as a lie if the detectives checked his date of birth. He also lied about how long he had been living in Keddie by adding 2 weeks to the time. He lied that Marilyn was his niece. He said that Marilyn was awake when he and Martin came home from the bar the second time, despite her saying she would have been asleep when they came home. And he claimed that he never met Sue, despite all of them stopping by her cabin before they left for the bar. In Martin's interview, he said that Justin might have seen something, and in quotes, without me detecting him. Somehow both detectives didn't even notice this. Martin also talked to the detectives about the hammers that were used to commit the murders, and he said that recently he had lost his own hammer. Despite these events making the 2 seem more likely to be involved, both detectives didn't conduct any more interviews with the 2 men since they didn't believe they were involved. After the investigation, Martin would relocate to Klamath, California, which is about 6 hours away from Keddie. Bo would return to Chicago and proceed to scam multiple police officers out of money. He would be caught and almost be put into prison, but in 1988 he died and never served any time. It wouldn't be until 1984 that finally the bones of Tina would be recovered. A skull was found about 30 miles from Keddie, and it wouldn't be until many months later that an anonymous caller told the Butte County Sheriff's Office that the skull was Tina Sharp's. This call would be recorded, and the original and backup recording would be given to someone in law enforcement, but both would end up getting lost. In 2000, it was announced that Martin passed away, and shortly after his death, his therapist came forward to police and told them that he had confessed to the murders. The reason he said he had killed Sue was because she was trying to convince Marilyn to get a divorce. As for John, Dana, and Tina, he never said who had killed them. On March 24, 2016, Martin's hammer that he said went missing was found, and according to authorities, quote, the location it was found, it would have been intentionally put there. It would not have been accidentally misplaced. To this day, however, the Keddie cabin murders are still unsolved. It's 1984. A man sits in his house as his mental health rockets downward with a crash inevitable. He has recently been laid off from his job as a food engineer, and now when his friends and family look at him, all they see is a man struggling with paranoia. He walks around venting and in fear that people are out to get him, and when they ask him about who these people are, he fails to give further detail. This behavior continues onward into 1985, and on October 25th, at around 11 p.m., he stands up and shouts, "Now I get it," and quickly snatches a piece of paper and scribbles down the word YOGTZE. This is the story of Gunther Stoll, or the YOGTZE Case. He continued to write multiple letters before storming out of the house, leaving his wife. He would make his way into the town of Düsseldorf, Germany, and barge into the pub and order a beer. Before he even took a sip, he would fall straight onto his face, which caused him to briefly lose consciousness. When he woke up, he would hop into a Volkswagen Golf and drive away from the pub. After leaving the pub at around 11:30, it is unknown where he was at and what he was doing, but at 1 a.m. he arrived at his hometown of Heigersielbach. He made his way to one of the residents, which was an elderly woman that he had known since he was a kid. When she opened the door, he began lecturing her about this event that was going to happen that night. In quotes, he said, "Something's about to happen tonight, something pretty terrifying." Again though, he refused to go into detail about what he was talking about. She was obviously concerned and told him he should go stay at his parents' house that was nearby because she didn't trust him to drive home. He didn't want to do that and left without telling her where he was going. A couple hours later, two truck drivers discovered a crashed car in a ditch along Autobahn A45. They also apparently saw someone walking away from the crash scene. They didn't pay too much attention to the person walking away and instead went straight to the car to make sure the person inside was okay. Inside was Stoll, and he was alive, but he was also nude. The men quickly alerted for help, and as they were waiting, Stoll told them that there had been 4 cars with him, but they had all run off. He also said that none of them were his friends. Unfortunately, while on the way to the hospital, Stoll would lose his life. His cause of death would be labeled as vehicular manslaughter. Police theorized that Stoll had been injured in some sort of way and then placed in the car. Unfortunately, this case is still cold and only theories circulate around what happened to Stoll on that night. One theory is that the word YOGTZE was similar to his license plate, which was Y06T2E, and it could be a clue on who wanted him dead. Another theory is that YOGTZE is an anagram of zygote, which is an early stage of human development, and people who believe in this theory will tie it back to his job as a food engineer and say they could be related, but to be honest, for me, that makes no sense. You're waiting by a bus stop in Chicago. The man inside rolls down his window and offers you a ride, and you happily accept. Little do you know this is the last time you'll be able to cruise down Main Street and look at all the businesses covered in Christmas lights, as you've just been kidnapped by John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. His parents, John Stanley Gacy and Marion Gacy, decided to name him after the famous movie actor John Wayne. From an early age, Gacy would be beaten by his alcoholic father and would be called a sissy by him for being a mama's boy. Apparently during his childhood, Gacy would wear his mother's underwear. When Gacy became a teenager, he decided to drop out of high school and relocate to Las Vegas, where he would live for a short amount of time working in the mortuary before he left and returned back to Illinois. He would get enrolled at Northwestern Business College and do theater and graduated in 1963. Just a year later, he would marry his wife, Marilyn Myers, and they would relocate to Waterloo, Iowa, where they had 2 kids together. Gacy would take on the role as a manager for many KFC franchises. His life seemed to be going great as he had a great family, a good job, and he was involved in the community. That was until he got involved in sadism, which according to Google is the deriving pleasure, often sexual, from another's pain, suffering, or humiliation. In 1968, he would be convicted of sexual assault on a teenage boy and would be given a 10-year prison sentence. A year after his conviction, his wife divorced him and took their 2 children with her. In 1970, though, he would be paroled and released from prison and moved back to Chicago. Just a year later, he would go back to his old ways and was arrested for sexual assault twice, but he got lucky since they both got dropped. At this time, Gacy and his mom were able to get enough money together to get him a house in Norwood Park Township, where he would be adored by everyone in the community. He would go to events dressed up as a clown named Pogo or Patches. His life would improve even more as in 1972, he would get married to his second wife named Carol Huff, and in 1974, he founded a contracting business. But once again, it would come crashing down as the company mostly employed teenage boys, and Carol would discover a collection of adult magazines that Gacy had that contained boys and men. She also noticed that he would go out a lot during the nights. Just 4 years after their marriage, they got a divorce. It turns out though that he had been committing murders behind his wife's back for all those years. In 1972, Timothy McCoy would be waiting at the Greyhound bus station in Chicago when Gacy approached him and offered to take him to his house, as the teenager had a layover on his way home to Nebraska. The pair would arrive back at the house when all of a sudden, Gacy attacked McCoy with a knife, ending the teenager's life. He would proceed to kill 32 young boys from 1972 to 1978. He would approach his victims by usually offering them a job and inviting them back to his house. Once inside though, he would give them alcohol or drugs and ask if they wanted to see a magic trick. This magic trick was just handcuffing them so he could do whatever he wanted to them. He would usually rape and then strangle them to death. He then stuffed the bodies in his crawl space under the house. His last murder would be Robert Peist, who was only 15 years old. Luckily, the police would learn that the last person Peist was seen with was Gacy, so they were able to get a search warrant for his home. Once inside, there was a bunch of evidence leading to Gacy as the killer, as he had other people's licenses, drugs, and syringes. Once police got a second warrant though, which allowed them to check the crawl space, it was obvious. On December 21st, 1978, Gacy would be put into handcuffs and taken into custody. He would quickly admit to everything he had done. Later on though, he pleaded innocent by reason of insanity, and his defense supported this by saying psychologists had diagnosed him with schizophrenia. This wasn't a strong enough defense, as the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 murders and sentenced him to death via lethal injection. He would spend his days in prison by painting, in which one of them would end up on an album cover. Apparently, he also confessed to more murders, but none of them would ever be confirmed to be true. Gacy would make multiple appeals as an attempt to leave prison, but they were all declined, and on May 10th, 1994, he would be executed.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose.